Hi, everybody here and everybody out there on the internet who's are watching it now or watching it later. Welcome to our weekly basic income discussion. So this is our 13th one, and this week's topic is immigration. Obviously, when you're talking about immigration, you need to be thinking about individual countries and people coming to a particular country. So by default, since we're in the United States, we're going to be talking about the United States, immigration to the United States, although other examples of immigration related to basic income might come up during the discussion. So I want to start with a question, and the question is going to be prompted by a YouTube clip that we're going to watch on the big screen, if I can find my mouse cursor. Oh, it's not, but there it is. Okay. See if this plays.
Good evening, Mr. President. How's it going?
Fine, sir.
Good. No, it's not. Yeah. What's hard is that foreign policy has become a statement of what we won't do.
Yes, sir.
A new doctrine for a new century based not just on our interests, but on our values across the world. Well, that's pretty spicy stuff.
You wrote it, sir.
Yeah, I know. Why is a Kumanese life worth less to me than an American life?
I don't know, sir, but it is.
That was ballsy.
I won't be working here long.
Okay, so the question I want to ask everyone, and there's no right or wrong answer to this question, is, and different people are going to have different opinions on this, and I don't want us to be trying to argue over this and debate this, but it is relevant when we think about immigration and we think about citizens versus non-citizens and foreigners and things like that. So the question is, do you feel like our policies, our government policies should value foreign people's lives or non-American citizens' lives as much as we value American citizens' lives? So first I'm going to ask, who here thinks that we should prioritize American lives, like in big picture terms, we should prioritize American lives over non-citizen lives, citizen lives over non-citizen lives? Should. So, but can you?
Well, so often you raise points like, if
Yeah.
if the president were to prioritize foreign and American lives equally, that president would be there for long, and so like just the natural process is not to select for leaders who do this. So why raise the question?
I mean, from your personal moral perspective, I guess, do you value kind of every human life on the planet equally in the sense that you feel like the United States government should be doing more to take care of people who are not citizens, and that could be foreigners or people who live here who are not citizens. Yeah.
It's a bit, your question is confusing because who decides? I mean, depending on who you talk to, the value of an American versus a non-American life will be judged differently. Maybe the President of the United States would have a different opinion than me, for instance, because I'm a citizen and I value my life as much as yours.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's fine. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and also there is something about degrees of separation here. I mean, we value the lives of the people closest to us first, right? I mean, if we're making choices.
Yeah.
And
So I want to eliminate that factor by saying, it's an abstract, someone who you don't know, just an arbitrary American citizen who has no direct connection to you, like a nameless, faceless person.
But by being American, I'm saying that people would probably choose these widening rings. My family, my friends, then my country.
Right. So I'm really trying to isolate that one ring there. So I'm trying to eliminate the family and friends thing and ask about that one, the ring of fellow citizens.
And I'm saying that probably most people would value, just because they value immediate family, immediate friends, they would also value their country because they identify
But Alex's question is about our
My
personal
question is about
morality,
you
right?
personally. It's not about people in general or most
It's
people.
about the government, but I think they probably are acting in the self-interest.
But
of-
They're acting-
Alex's question is like, do I, Elizabeth, think that the government should value like random citizen in Poughkeepsie equal to like random other person
Right.
who's
Well,
not a citizen?
let me respond to Elizabeth
Okay, good.
because I think she's saying it the right way,
Okay.
and it's that if you were in charge of the government and there were no political implications to you not valuing, foreign people's lives equal to American lives.
No political implications?
No political implications.
But you were still.
I'm not talking about like what should the government do to be most politically successful. I'm saying if you were in charge of the government and you got to decide, and no one's gonna like vote you out of office just because you
Did people
decided.
vote you in? And how did those people?
We're not talking about the political implications.
This relates to my sense of duty also, if I could myself in the role.
Your sense of duty.
Yeah, because you're partly a representative elected official and representing interests. Like you could think of it that way, right? Like meant to represent interests.
Yeah. So in this scenario, you are not a
This scenario-
representative elected.
You're a benevolent dictator
You're a
in this
dictator,
situation.
yeah. And it's about what you think is best, not what you think the people want.
I
Yeah.
mean, ethically, it has to do with, it's an ethics question, really.
It is an ethics question, and there's no right answer. It's like
Well-
how many babies is a kitten worth, or how many kittens is a baby worth?
Right, but again, I'm going back to my point
Yeah.
that, for example, if you had to kill someone, to see them kill versus pushing a button and having that person die somewhere else.
Right, we're eliminating that because it's an abstract person who you don't know.
Do you want us to
You're
answer?
pushing a button and it's somewhere else. You're not actively right.
Do you want us to answer based on what we think we would actually be able to do in action, or like
So,
what we think is possible?
I'm gonna ask a more concrete question. So let's pick the life of a person in Kenya as opposed to an American life. And somehow in your head, try to think of how many Kenyan lives is one American life. So raise your hand if you feel like an American life should be worth more than 10 Kenyan lives. All right, 5 or more.
Is there really people to answer that question like 5 or really?
I mean, I don't know. It's just like whatever you feel in your gut. Okay, so two or more. Like is
Yeah.
I just want to establish
Okay.
that. Yeah. Okay. 2 or more. So nobody says 2 or more. So in theory, that means that we should be putting at least half as many resources into people in Kenya as we are into people in America.
Well, you said abstracted from duties of representation.
Abstracted from
And
duties of
abstracted from
representation.
political consequences.
Abstracted from political consequences, yeah. So I mean, there could be an argument to be made that each country should take care of its own citizens, and that's the most effective thing, and that's still abstracted. Martin.
So, there's a lot of ways to look at this.
Yeah.
Every 4 years, the president gets up and he swears an oath.
Yes.
And so there is sort of a legal aspect
Right.
to what that individual is legally obligated to do, which may appear, at least, to valuing one
Yeah.
nationality's life over the lives of.
That was.
Yeah, it's the president's job to represent American citizens and to take care of the American people, and that is part of the job. But we're creating a hypothetical world in which your job is just to do the best thing that you feel is morally best. So certainly, someone could argue, like I was saying, that if each country takes care of its own people, then that's actually better for everyone in the world. So the idea that America would be extending its resources to take care of people in Kenya might actually, on net, hurt people because you're diverting resources away from America, like that kind of thing. So that's why you can have a number that's greater than 1 here, I think.
I think it's really complicated. I mean, when you get
Yeah.
into actual policies, there's also like, there's limits to this, but there's a degree to which well-being, like response to change, response to expectations. So if you suddenly like diverted a ton of resources from one country into another, it's a huge shock, like,
Yeah.
et cetera.
Yeah, I'm not really getting into that at this point. So who's between 1 and 2? Like there's some degree to which we should be prioritizing Americans over Canadians. Nobody's between 1 and 2.
In your hypothetical scenario, where you've abstracted away from.
Yeah.
But for who? For
Yeah.
you? Because you're an American. For Canada. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, people are in here are going to be speaking in terms of their own.
Yeah.
You won't get off on it. You can't say you're unspoken.
Okay. So am I correct in saying that everyone? Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I'll say greater than 1.
You'll take greater than 1. Okay, thank you for doing that. I thought it would be like at least half the people.
Well, you kind of abstracted it to the point that like it's sort of hard to market.
No, I mean I think there's a strong argument to be made that it's sufficient for each country to take care of its own.
Right, but you abstracted away from that.
I'm abstracting away from the political reality, and I want to get to the underlying economics. And it's possible that the underlying economics created the political reality. So there's a reason why the
Oh, wait,
politics.
so then I might take greater than 1 too, if you're talking
Okay.
about if you're including some of those kinds of things. But it depends on what you mean by weighing the lives differently, because if you think that it's actually best for the well-being of the world for the US to value its own citizens higher, like is that valuing the US life higher than the Kenyan life, or is that just a convoluted way of making it equal?
Yeah, it depends on which level you're looking at.
Yeah.
Like if you value every life equally, and you believe that everyone is better off if you go ahead.
You're talking about economics, so you have to specify, okay, economic life of an American might be more important to us, but life in general, I think it's a different animal. You know, economically, every country should take care of its own people.
I'm not even sure about. I don't even know if I agree with that statement. I'm just saying that's a reasonable position to
I
have.
think I'm having a little trouble with that as being more concrete, because like also, if we're talking about economics, it gets into like, the connection, like what kinds of things are you proposing?
Right.
I just feel like it's not concrete enough for me to really answer.
Okay, go ahead, Richard.
Are you talking about like let's say a wrongful death case and someone dies and they're like 18 and their life is worth $3 million or something? Are you saying it something like that?
I mean, that's one way in our society that we kind of quantify this kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, that general kind of calculation. I mean, it's a moral dilemma, right? So there's no right answer.
And it might be different if you're talking about preventing deaths versus like economic prosperity.
Right. So in the video that we watched, they're talking about war, and they're talking about preventing American deaths versus preventing deaths of people in a foreign country. Yeah.
That's more concrete, so that's helpful. Because like the same dollar in the hands of one person versus another in cultural context, etc., doesn't necessarily equate to the same happiness. But like death is kind of death, so it's a little bit easier to understand as a comparison. Yeah.
So do people feel like they would change their answers if I was specifically talking about like life or death? All right, that's fine.
Probably, yeah.
Mostly I asked this question just to establish that when we're arguing about whether basic income should only go to citizens and stuff like that, it's depending on whether you feel like citizens are what we should be prioritizing, and maybe you're feeling that because that's the way the politics are organized. Depending on whether you feel like we should be prioritizing citizens or not, then the answer might be different. And both answers can be correct depending on which side of that you fall. So I don't want people to be arguing based on this question that I just asked. I want people to understand that different people might fall on different places in the spectrum of whether to value an American life or how much to value an American life more than a foreign life. So that's why I asked the question. Yeah, go ahead.
Isn't the question more what the citizen or non-citizen gives the country in return for UBI?
That's also a question.
You don't necessarily have to be a citizen to pay taxes, because immigrants do pay taxes.
Green card holders.
Huh?
Green card holders, they also
Yeah.
contribute.
So
Yeah. So
wouldn't that be more of a
Well, so that's another question. Do we feel like basic income is something that should only go to people who are contributing? And I think that part of the definition of basic income is that it's not that way.
I disagree.
Well, it goes to everyone equally,
I
regardless.
know, but
Yeah.
contributing, I mean,
Thinking.
potentially contributing, I would add to my definition of my, if you are in this country and you can potentially contribute, not necessarily economically, but any other way, and you are a part of this society, then I think we should consider them as, worthy of sharing with you.
Okay. So how do you define that potential?
Well, they're here. they exist
Okay.
in our environment. So potentially they contribute, not necessarily economically, but in other ways they are part of this country.
So here's another question. Should basic income go to people who are not physically here in the country? What about Americans?
American?
Either one.
Expatriates.
Should they go to expatriates? Should they go to Americans who are traveling abroad, living
It
abroad?
depends. If they pay taxes, yes.
Okay. Okay.
I
So
mean,
anyone.
if they abide by the laws of this country.
Yeah.
Taxes or whatever. Yeah, you should.
So should anyone out there in the world, whether they're an American citizen or not, if they say, I'm willing to pay taxes, should they receive a basic income?
No, the American. They should get UBI in their own country.
Okay, so that's kind of what I'm getting at.
Okay.
So there's this line that people draw between who deserves to get a basic income and who doesn't. So Madeline is drawing the line at if you're a citizen of another country and you're living in that country, you should be getting it from your own country. And I think another question we might ask is what do we, so back to kind of the contribution or the potential contribution question, what do we ultimately care about? And I would say that it's not that we ultimately care about contribution, we ultimately care about the well-being of people, and we feel like contribution supports the well-being of people, which is why we care about contribution. So then we have to ask what constitutes contribution, and is the stuff that we traditionally think of as contribution, like paying taxes, actually something that supports the well-being of other people in the country?
And
Other citizens,
a related question that's central is like, what is the cost to each additional, like the cost associated with each additional not given, right?
Right. So these are all questions. So I want to get to, does anyone have anything they want to add right now before I get to quotes from the article?
When we're talking about immigration right now, we're talking about legal immigration.
We are talking about immigration in general, but certainly, yeah,
That's another
whether it's
issue.
legal or illegal is
There's a big difference.
Yeah.
go ahead. Elizabeth.
But I don't know what you're going to frame the big difference as, but if we're going to talk about contribution, which I think is toxic, but if we are going to, like, illegal immigrants like contribute a lot, like
Yes.
both in the labor and in the like literal, like they pay taxes that they then don't collect through social services.
Yeah.
And so we can get down like a moral argument about like the difference, but if we're going to posit this as being about contribution, I
Right.
think like
But it's also about collecting services, and illegal immigrants cannot collect some.
right, which is a thing that's busted
Well,
about
so-
our system.
So the
But-
question, so basic income is going to be of service, right? So the
Right.
question is, who should receive it?
Right. Yeah.
And Elizabeth, I think, would probably say that
Everybody.
people who are here illegally should also receive it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would, I might go further and say that there's no reason why we shouldn't, or perhaps we should ask whether it makes sense to give basic income to everyone in the world, like the United States giving basic income to everyone in the world. So that kind of pushes beyond Madeline's comfort.
Yeah.
That's a little
Yeah.
strange.
Yeah, I'd be curious about like how economic.
Yeah.
I've been here long enough to have ideas about how you think it's economically feasible.
Right.
But
Um,
yeah, my like moral instinct would be like, well, okay, like national borders are a often toxic social construct, and like why we would say, okay, people who live within our borders and then are like citizens but abroad, like there's not a clear reason why you should delineate other than the feasibility.
Yeah, and I think this brings up like the key issue that's at the center of both of these two articles, which is this tension between having open immigration and providing people with social services, including something like basic income. They don't talk about basic income in the articles, but this is kind of what the issue is. And if you say everyone who's here should receive a basic income and we're allowing open immigration, then you're basically saying, since anyone can come here, you're basically saying that we should do the equivalent of offer basic income to everyone in the world. All you have to do is come here.
You're
And then
better off
you're
not making them come there, and probably we're just.
right. So it might actually be cheaper to pay them the basic income while they stay home in their own country. So there's that kind of calculation there. And then when we're talking about contribution, in terms of what's produced for our people in our economy, like we talk about illegal immigrants doing a lot of labor and contributing resources to the economy. Foreign countries contribute a lot of resources to our economy too. Like we buy a lot of stuff from China, we buy a lot of stuff from Japan. So there's an argument to be made that citizens of foreign countries are also contributing to the United States economy. So there's all these levels here. And I think we all have like an intuition for what we feel is right and what we feel makes sense, but we're not all going to share the same intuition. Yeah. Ready for some quotes? Yeah. All right. So here's the first one. So the first article is called "What Milton Friedman Really Said," and it's written by someone, but it's got a bunch of quotes from Milton Friedman, and all the quotes I selected were the actual Milton Friedman quotes. So one thing he said was, "The United States before 1914, as you know, had completely free immigration. Anybody could get in a boat and come to these shores, and if they landed at Ellis Island, he was an immigrant. Was that a good thing or a bad thing?" Now we have to keep in mind that there aren't really social services at this time, right? So it's not like they're coming here and potentially draining. I mean, maybe they are in some ways, and that they could be a drain on their local community or something like that. I'm worried about immigrants bringing disease.
Which was a real problem. Like, for example, an immigrant or someone from overseas ended up leading to the death of a lot of people in Iceland. I just learned from the Spanish. I mean, carrying the Spanish flu from Europe. And so this was a real problem with these infectious diseases, especially before antibiotics.
When was the Spanish flu? Because I feel like it was around
Like 1919.
1919. Okay, all right.
So I mean, obviously this wasn't this man's fault, but like a very large percentage of people in Iceland died. So they were checking people at Ellis Island for this and stuff. And just to point out that it wasn't completely cost-free, that people coming and going, and this was a real concern.
Yeah.
So there was screening.
Right.
Has anyone,
Yeah, that's right. And
has anyone seen that movie Gangs of New York?
Yeah.
Well, that's what you're talking about. Immigrants with absolutely no rights, no support. That was the immigration situation before what he's talking about. And that's what
wait, there wasn't
So-
completely free immigration before 1914. Didn't they have all those like laws in the 1800s? Maybe they started in 1914.
There was certainly a lot of discrimination against immigrants, but I think legally it
They
was
didn't
pretty
do the
easy.
laws until after.
Yeah. So do you think that? So obviously there was these horrible conditions for immigrants, but do we think that overall immigration was a positive thing?
According to him, yes, overall it was a good thing because it basically created this country, and it's a known fact. But the fact that he says that that was a good thing, he implies that it was a good thing because it didn't cost anything, and that I have a problem with.
I think his argument is a little more, although it's key to it, right? But it's got the nuance of like, he's thinking like an economist. So he's thinking, okay, nobody's going to move there until they're better off. And under what conditions are they better off? Well, they're better off under these conditions where they have to work really hard, they don't get any social services. So that's really going to select for a mutually beneficial transfer, because they're only going to leave if they can make themselves better off in these conditions that are clearly making the country better off too. That was kind of his argument. That makes sense. So,
No, but then he goes on to say that after that period,
right.
things went down the drain because there were social services. Well, that is the world upside down, because you really believe that immigrants come here because they want to collect welfare?
I'm not
They
saying my
still,
personal
they
opinion.
still come to.
I think he actually
improve their
thinks that
lives.
illegal immigration is paradoxically beneficial for
Well, illegal immigrants don't receive welfare.
exactly, that's what I'm saying. He
Yeah.
makes that argument.
And they might be fleeing from a situation.
Sure.
Not to contribute or improve their lives, but just not to be killed.
Right,
To come
even
here.
in the pre-1914 argument, he kind of leaves that out.
Yeah, he
that people
does.
could just be fleeing
Yeah.
really bad.
Yeah, like
So I-
all the potato famine, I mean, they're fleeing starvation.
Right. So I think there's no reason to immigrate unless you at least think you're going to be better off
Right.
when you get here.
You could be misinformed.
You could be misinformed and end up being worse off.
Right.
It's unclear to me whether, I mean, my guess is that most of the people who were in these really difficult conditions in New York, even though they were in those difficult conditions, like what we would consider horrible, they were still probably better off than how they were when they left, because they made a decision, probably knowing something about like what New York was like. Maybe it wasn't perfect. Maybe a lot of the people who ended up coming were misled into thinking that New York was actually better than it was, and there's probably some of that too.
But there was a lot of famine at the time. So
Yeah.
we didn't have the ways of immigration, which is pretty bad.
Yeah, so you're fleeing something horrible, and maybe you're just rolling the dice and hoping for a better opportunity.
It's better than death.
Right.
It's better than certain death.
Better than certain death.
Starvation.
Yeah. Yeah, and then that's certainly not the standard we should be striving for. Whatever is better than certain death.
That's certain death. So
Yeah,
kind of uncertain death. Let's go there.
right.
But it is an argument for open borders, the fleeing part of it.
Sure, and I don't
It's a
think
moral issue.
Milton Friedman is arguing that people weren't suffering after they got here, or bad things weren't happening to them after they got here. I think he was just arguing that in expectation, they weren't going to be as bad off as they were where they came from. I think that's what he's saying. So I don't think he's pretending that the horrible conditions in New York didn't exist. Does that make sense?
Well, yes, I know, but he says illegal immigration is the only good kind because they don't ask for anything. That's what he says, isn't it?
He says something like that a little bit further down. But right now we're talking about this specific quote. So he's just kind of posing this question: do we think it was a good or a bad thing to have open immigration at that time? And I think people come here because they think they're going to be better off, and I think that's always true. And if we have social programs and we're providing, if we're providing everyone a basic income who comes here, then that would factor into their calculation of being better off. Milton Friedman might argue that this would take away from other people and that we should be prioritizing American citizens over
Take away in what sense?
resources. So if we're putting resources into helping immigrants, then maybe there aren't as many resources to go around to help citizens who are already living here. But if you just take away the social programs, then you know that the immigrants are coming here because they're going to be better off absent the social programs. So that means they must be producing something, where they feel they can contribute something in order to get paid and that kind of thing.
There's also an assumption there that paid labor is contributing resource-wise, is net contributory
Yes.
more than the spending.
So there is an assumption that if you have a job and you are working, that you are contributing something. And I don't know if that assumption always holds, especially, for those of you who were here last week, we talked about this.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that probably the jobs that we talked about last week, the make work bullshit jobs,
Yeah.
aren't the kind of jobs in general that immigrants will get. They'll be getting more useful jobs like, I don't know,
Unless
nanny care.
Could you say that again?
I think that the bullshit jobs we were talking about last week are not as likely to be filled by immigrants. I think they're at a higher level. I think you have to be pretty educated to get those bullshit jobs.
Didn't
in an
get a
office
chance to read
somewhere.
that.
I do, yeah.
Unless
Great
we,
deformation.
unless we
No,
resist,
bullshit jobs.
Oh, I read the blog post, but not the book. not the
unless we
book.
resist
I read the
automation.
book.
Oh, you read the
A
book?
week or so.
Yeah. Oh, so.
What did you think about that?
So, I hate when I read, because I pull from the library and then I make notes and then I don't get my notes captured before the ebook expires. And that book is actually surprisingly popular, so I'm waitlisted on 2 library networks.
Wow.
And it was waitlisted for, it seemed like quite a while to get it the first time. So I'm kind of surprised. And actually, my son's headed to LSE in the fall. I'm just telling him to meet his professor. That's crazy. But I think the general premise of the book is that most jobs are bullshit.
Right.
Okay. And so how does he do in sort of presenting that? I think he makes a decent case for it. This sort of idea that if the job went away, would you really miss the work that got done? Not the person, not the human consequences and all this. Just how many jobs, if the work the job was accomplishing disappeared, you wouldn't miss it. You wouldn't even notice it missing. And he makes that case.
Yeah. Does he talk about the jobs that immigrants do?
Not that I recall. I hate when I look at my notes.
Okay.
Because I would have noted something like that.
Yeah.
No, not the way I think that you're asking the question, sort of like this debate of, immigrants doing work that Americans don't want to do, all that aspect of it.
You talked about.
I don't recall that being really much if he did, that I don't recall, then it was only cursory, because
Did you talk about,
Go ahead.
future consequences? Like maybe people wouldn't notice now, but then research doesn't get done, and so we don't have a cure later. No one's ever going to notice the cure we don't have, but like, I wonder what his standard was for noticing his
I don't recollect that he delved into that, which is, certainly a fair way to look at it.
for a lot of things. I mean,
Yeah.
the consequences might be hard to notice, but so important to our future.
It seems like we need some things to maybe we don't.
So my intuition is that the jobs that immigrants do, it's unclear to me how necessary they are. I think there's some degree of bullshittiness in even the jobs that immigrants do, and I think that's partly because some of these jobs are created as a result of economic policy that's designed to stimulate jobs in the first place. Stimulate jobs for the purpose of giving people money, and then maybe some of that money ends up going to immigrants or illegal immigrants.
Right.
But maybe some of those jobs even don't need to exist.
Right. And I was saying, like, if the government policy is targeting a certain level of unemployment, then if immigrants do certain jobs, other people end up doing other jobs, and maybe those jobs are bullshit jobs, and so like indirectly.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Madam.
You're saying that nanny's work is not necessary?
I was saying that I would say that a nanny's work is not necessary if that nanny is taking care of a kid whose parents would prefer to take care of their own kid, but they're off working at jobs because they have to earn an income, and those jobs don't even exist, for example.
It's not the nanny that created that situation.
Right.
It's not the nanny's fault. It's not the
No,
nanny.
I'm not
Yeah.
saying her fault. It didn't start with the nanny. It started with you could say the work ethic or a desire for a better, more higher income.
Sure.
So I don't quite understand your definition of
So
the fact that the jobs are done by immigrants are not really jobs or necessary.
I think it's difficult to look at any one individual job and analyze that specific job and say this job isn't necessary. But what we can do is once we've implemented the basic income, we can look at the jobs that are no longer there anymore and say, oh, okay, those were the unnecessary jobs. So there's going to be some nannies, but maybe there won't be as many nannies because more people are able to stay home with their kids, for example.
Okay.
Something. Yeah.
Immigrants actually do every kind of jobs in USA,
Yeah.
I believe. For example, would you consider research jobs as the bullshit jobs. No, right?
Right.
So
No, I actually
there are
think
lots
research
of
is, yeah.
Researchers who with immigrants in USA.
Oh,
So they
yeah.
also make very powerful USA.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
because of their contribution for science, and I believe that USA is making very good thing by providing them freedom and equal rights, so they can. So by doing so, USA gets the best brains from all over the world.
Yeah.
So as I said,
That's not-
they do all kinds of jobs.
Right,
Not
yes.
only-
No, not just
From a-
nanny and stuff, yeah.
From a purely economic perspective, the argument is different when the person is less fungible. So like I think a lot of what many people are talking about are jobs where they're imagining that almost anybody can do the job like roughly equally, which of course doesn't hold in a lot of cases. And so like what you're saying in research, it's not really the case. It's kind of you want like the most well-suited people to that job from all over the world. It's kind of a different situation, and I think the arguments don't apply to it as, or he touches on it a little in the article, but I think it's a bit different.
You
And
know,
I don't know.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. I don't know how was the situation at that date.
Right.
90. I don't know, but today it's a good thing to do that. I believe for a country.
Yeah, right.
There are 44 million immigrants in America.
Okay.
So that's about 13% of the population. And so do you think those jobs could be, what do you call it, either reduced or with a UBI, you would think that some of these.
Yeah, I wouldn't say all of them. I think there, as Sultan rightly pointed out, there are plenty of really important jobs that are being done by immigrants. I think in the economy as a whole, because we expect people to receive their incomes from the labor market, we distort the labor market. We create ways to force money to people through the labor market by creating jobs or labor regulations and stuff like that. And I think, yeah, some of the jobs that immigrants do, but some of the jobs that everybody does, will no longer really need to exist once people are able to receive more income
So you
from
really
outside jobs.
don't make a distinction between jobs and jobs done by citizens.
In general, I would say no. I would not make a distinction. But in the particular case of illegal immigrants who are maybe being paid below minimum wage, or doing jobs that Americans wouldn't want to do at that wage for whatever reason, probably because it's below minimum wage. That's
Less distorted.
that's maybe a little bit less distorted. Like those jobs might be more necessary, but like I was saying before, there could be some spillover from the just job creation policies of our government or economic policy that actually result in there being more of those jobs than there need to be too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I think it's important to make a distinction between those 44 million immigrants and then that section that is not legal, because
Yeah.
it's almost like you're talking about apples and oranges,
Yeah.
even economically, So,
Right.
and so it's difficult for
Yeah.
me to.
No, I agree. I think it's important to distinguish between the jobs that are usually done by illegal immigrants and the jobs that are done by immigrants who are here legally, which look a lot like the jobs that everybody else is doing.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're even more important than some of the jobs other people are doing, because in order to get the visa, the work visa, you have to demonstrate how important the work is, and an American can't do this job as well as I can.
So it's actually harder.
Yeah.
Right, it's not a
So again, that brings me back to what he says, that illegal immigrants are the only section of immigration that is good, because they do not drain the resources of this country.
Yeah, I don't think that's correct. I don't think he's right about that, because I think the immigrants who come here legally are, here for a reason because they're contributing something.
He also doesn't seem to consider different qualifications for the job. Like, that's what I was kind of pointing out to some of the researchers. Like, he doesn't seem to consider situations where the best qualified person could be outside of the country.
Right.
Like, that didn't seem to factor in, at least to what was quoted in this, which of course changes like the contribution. He seemed to be treating these jobs as fungible, and like someone in the US could do it really well. That seemed to be his mindset. But maybe he's clarified it elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think specifically the type of immigration he's talking about is the kind of immigration where we're not checking to make sure that the person is here because they're contributing something valuable that an American couldn't contribute or something like that. I think he's specifically talking about the type of immigration that we've made illegal, and he's arguing that in the presence of social programs, it makes sense to keep it illegal, right? So he's not necessarily talking about the immigrants who are doing research or other things.
Although sometimes,
Although he doesn't make that distinction clear,
as
but
a
I think
side,
that's what
as
he's
a
talking
side
about.
point, politically, sometimes they don't exclude immigrant. Like, there's been harsher restrictions, I think, on academics.
Yes. I think that's right.
And then he says the
Yeah.
solution is to abolish the welfare state.
He
Because
does
that's,
say that,
yeah,
which is interesting because this is the same guy who argued for something like a basic income. And a lot of the basic income proponents, cite Milton Friedman and say like, oh, here's this guy who was so conservative and he wanted basic income. But that kind of goes against what he's saying here about immigration.
He might be considering on topic at a time. I mean, he's an academic, not a policymaker, right? I don't know who that
He's
Yeah.
not a policy maker.
He had a lot of influence on Reagan.
He had a lot of influence on Reagan, and he was definitely, he had an agenda. He was trying to change the world. He had like that group of Chicago economists who went down to Chile and did that whole thing and reorganized their economy. Yeah, that was
So he
all.
was trying to implement it related to implementation.
He was very kind of politically driven, which is also interesting because he's also the guy who advocated positive economics, which is basically we're only supposed to describe and we're not supposed to prescribe. But he wove his politics into that, and his descriptions, came to conclusions that happened to line up with what his politics already were, and that kind of thing. It's really hard to if you're doing economics, it's really hard to get your own personal views out of what you're arguing. Yeah, out of your theories and models and everything. Yeah. But I think he's clearly smart, and his analysis is interesting. And when we get to the second article, we'll see that Paul Krugman, who's a liberal economist, he comes to the same conclusion that you can't have both generous social programs and open immigration. Like you have to pick one or the other. And but he comes down the other side of the argument. He says we need to limit immigration so we can have enough social programs. Yeah.
I'm going to say,
Yeah, that's metal.
Krugman says limit immigration, but I don't know what that means because I think you have to specify what kind of immigration. Otherwise,
Yeah, I don't think he's saying no immigration at all, but I think he's saying that immigration needs to be regulated and controlled. We need to decide who to let in. Otherwise, we'll get a bunch of people coming in just to benefit from the social programs and have resources used on them.
So I
yeah,
guess
I was going to add to this that I'm going to look at Germany, for instance.
Yeah.
That they took in 1 million refugees
Syria.
in 1 year.
Yeah.
Wow. And the difference, I believe, was, and it was an open border situation because anybody who wanted to go to Germany just could. But their solution was to actually really work hard at integrating these people so that they actually contributed very strongly to the economy, to the German economy. Whereas here, we're trying to make it really hard for immigrants to
integrate. Yeah.
to integrate. So there is a contradiction. That's why I'm saying it depends on what kind of immigrant you're talking about.
Yeah.
And what you do with immigrants.
For Germany, you mean like 1970s?
So
No,
most
no,
of
no,
people
no.
are Syrian
Recently.
Recently?
With
They
Syrian
had 1
refugees.
million?
1 million.
From where?
Syria.
Yeah.
Are you sure?
Yes.
There were a lot more that they didn't let in than they did.
Uh,
Yeah. There are a lot of Syrian refugees who are not able to get to Germany. That's something that's also true. Yes.
So even there, it wasn't a completely open situation. Like they were presumably thinking about who they could integrate, how many people they could integrate, like where
Right.
No, it was in the beginning, it was
In the beginning, it was open, and then they restricted it. And 1 million sounds like a lot of people, but really, in the grand scheme of things, that was just a token amount.
and for Germany, it's nothing because their population 80 million or something, so it's not too big for them.
Right.
almost 1% in a year is a lot.
Yeah.
As a shock to a country.
That's a pretty big.
That's a
Pretty big,
huge
yeah,
amount.
impact.
In my mind, that was a huge amount. All at once, almost 1% of your population from another country, like all at once. It's a big
I
deal.
remember where was it, Cologne, or where was there was pretty significant, sort of New Year's Eve sort of civilian mass.
Yeah. It was not. Do you know about this? Remember this?
What is it?
What's it called? That a bunch of young immigrants started to grab women's, private parts during a Christmas celebration. I think it was.
Oh,
So
wow.
that was a big scandal.
Yeah, I didn't hear about that. That's unfortunate.
I guess we're putting the cultural stuff aside for this, just to be clear about what we're doing
Um,
for this discussion. Since we're focused on the economics.
Yeah, I mean, like, that could just have easily happened with people who weren't immigrants.
I'm not,
So-
I'm not specifying, this just made me think of it. I'm not
Right.
gonna say whether that's what it
I think we kind of want to set aside these like anecdotal examples of immigrants doing certain bad things because everybody like immigrants, non-immigrants, crime is committed by all different segments of the population, that kind of thing. Unless you have like I don't think anybody has like any strong evidence that immigrants are more likely to commit serious crimes or something like that.
I wasn't interested, not so much as like just general questions that are maybe morally neutral about like where you have two different cultures and there's coordination issues and then like all that kind of stuff. I'm just wondering if we're leaving that aside because we're focusing on the economics.
We can talk about that if you feel like it's relevant.
Well, I
especially
just
in
want to
context.
add to this
Yeah, go ahead.
event that the policy then went from being outraged to implementing education centers for
Okay.
these young immigrants to teach them that grabbing women's private parts was not part of their culture,
Right.
and so that was their response.
I think that's good, and I think that's good for cultural stuff in general. Like Bethany was talking about the concern that maybe we could have a lot of immigrants coming from countries where they don't have very good women's rights and stuff like that, and then now they're voting, and does that change the culture here, and is that going to be a problem? But I think being proactive and educating and integrating people
But
is
the speed of immigration matters for that.
Right.
Like if we're getting into that, like if you suddenly all of a sudden like 3/4 of your country's population was from countries that didn't value women's rights, like you're kind of screwed. It's
Right.
very hard to change that those people's minds to work it all at once.
Um, yeah.
So anyway,
Go ahead, Martin.
That's been a little personal anecdote to the whole immigration thing.
Yeah.
On my dad's side of the family, the ancestors immigrated after the Franco-Prussian War. And my last name is Fonterisch, and the von is a form of like knighthood, a title. So the family, where the ancestor was knighted after the first service in the Franco-Prussian War. To which my dad used to like to say, the knighthood stuff was all fine if instead he'd gotten this ancestor had gotten either money or land, he wouldn't have had to leave Germany.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Anyway, I was mostly thinking because we might want to focus on the economics because there's all these other things, but I kind of not related to basic income. So
Yeah, and the cultural question actually, if you're worried about immigration, but if it weren't for the cultural stuff, you'd want open immigration and basic income. Maybe you give them basic income where they're at instead of allowing them to immigrate. Yeah, so that.
that also could improve, like, the way that would give everybody in the world the most freedom would be to like allow open immigration but not require it for the basic income. Because obviously then people would express their preferences that way they want. People might not want to leave their.
Right, or maybe you allow open immigration and you give everybody basic income and other social benefits, but maybe you don't make them citizens, so maybe they can't vote or something like that. Or maybe it takes some time for that, so they don't take over politically with whatever. Yeah. So there's all kinds of nuances there. So I want to go to the next quote. It is one thing to have free immigration to jobs. It is another thing to have free immigration to welfare. And you cannot have both. If you have a welfare state, if you have a state in which every resident is promised a certain minimal level of income or a minimum level of subsistence, regardless of whether he works or not, produces it or not, then it really is an impossible thing.
Is this still Friedman?
This is still Friedman. So is it, do we agree with that? Do we think it's an impossible thing? I mean, I personally, I don't think it's an impossible thing. I think certainly if you allow everybody to immigrate into your country and you give them basic income and that spending that they undertake uses up a lot of resources and you start getting to the limits of what your economy can produce, then it might be the case that the amount of basic income you can afford is lower. So it might change the calculus in terms of what the optimal level of basic income is. But I don't even know if that's the case, especially in the long term. People are really fantastic and amazing to have on your side. And I think, like China's got a huge population, and part of the reason they're catching up and maybe going to surpass us economically and maybe in other ways is that they have so many people. People are really, really valuable, especially in the long term. So I don't even know if we wouldn't be better off having more people.
Well, this also, he talks about a welfare state, and there's an implication that, as with welfare, there's going to be taxes, and that people will be resentful of having more taxes. And I don't think that you're talking about that. So,
Right.
It's kind of confusing because he's talking about a minimal level of income or minimum level of subsistence, which sounds like basic income, but it isn't. He's also talking about welfare state, which implies taxes. So I'm just
Well, I don't think
that out.
I don't think welfare state implies taxes, but I do think you're right that he's assuming that the income that we give the immigrants is being funded through taxation.
Right, in which case then he's against it for other reasons than the ones you state. He's talking about having people taxed that wouldn't ordinarily be taxed, so they're taking away something that.
Well, sort of, but I'll get back to that in a second.
Okay,
Let's go to Madeline.
He doesn't say it, but every immigrant legally pays as much tax as any other citizen. So I don't understand his argument.
Because when he's talking about free immigration, that's just letting everyone come
Right.
in.
Yeah, but then.
Right.
So they might not
everybody pays
have
taxes.
a job.
I think his argument is that a lot of the people who will be unable to pay taxes, will be unable to find a job, would still come because they can receive the basic income. So he would say that those people would not be paying taxes in practice. Like
So
they
what's
might.
the difference between that and a citizen who is unemployed?
There's no difference. But this comes back to the question of prioritizing our citizens over immigrants.
Okay, what does the prioritizing consist of though? Monetarily speaking.
Right. So you brought up the issue of taxes and as a contrast to the kinds of things I talk about. But really, when he's talking about taxes or thinking about taxes, he's thinking that the taxes represent real resources in the economy. That's taking resources away from everyone else.
Right.
So I think that's still a valid way to think about it. It just might not directly correspond to money. It would correspond more to what capacity the economy has to produce for people. So it's still kind of like there's an analogous concern if our economy is tapped out and then more people are coming in and they don't really have resources to contribute, they have labor to contribute, but we don't necessarily need more labor, then maybe that could be a drain on the resources going to everyone
So
else.
certainly you could imagine waterfront property is like a limited resource. So there, like if you have the entire world's population in the United States, it's like, there's not, but waterfront properties would be really hard to get. And then it's just a question of like how many resources are like that and would be tapped out at some point.
Right, or if you could think of, are we able to produce enough food
Right,
for
exactly.
everyone?
Right.
And that gets to be a really tricky question because when we talk about producing for people in our economy, you have to factor in the fact that we can import stuff from all the other countries too.
Right.
So then you start getting into, well, are people willing to export to us? At what point do you get to a place where they're not willing to sell to us at reasonable prices and then have inflation? For example, if we're just saying we're going to give all these people all this money and they're going to keep buying stuff from you, they might be like, well, wait a minute, you're just printing money and sending us money and we're sending you actual stuff, like that kind of thing. So then it gets into like monetary economics and foreign exchange and the values of currencies in terms of each other and that kind of thing. So it can be really complicated to figure out, and I don't know the answer. It could very well be that we could have the same level of basic income, sustain the same level of basic income, and have open immigration. My hunch is that, especially if we're allowing a lot of immigration at once, we'd initially have a lower level of basic income that we can afford, at least for a while until things kind of adjust in the global economy. So that's just kind of my thought. So yeah, he gets back to, he says it's one thing to have free immigration to jobs. So it comes back to this assumption that if you're working at a job, that you're somehow contributing to the economy.
Right. You kind of assume you're contributing
Right.
commensurate, like resources commensurate to the dollars you get in your job. That's a really strong assumption. I just reiterate.
Right.
That's inherent. That's not.
And there's this assumption in most mainstream macroeconomic models that labor is the most important resource in the economy. That everything kind of depends on labor, and if you have less labor, then your productive capacity goes down. If you have more labor, then your productive capacity goes up. And I don't think that's entirely accurate. So if they, even if they're immigrating to jobs, I don't know that means they're somehow contributing more, unless the job is really something that does contribute. Yeah, go ahead, Zoltan.
When it comes to immigration, people generally tend to think that all of them immigrated for earning more money. But
Sure.
maybe half of them immigrated for more freedom.
Yeah.
They don't like how system works in their own country. So
Yeah.
or it's not only about money.
Yeah.
Sorry?
And safety, like we talked about with wars and
Yes.
Yeah, I think, that's right. It's not just about money, it's about being better off in general. They're coming here because they feel like they're going to have a better life here.
And even some of them, they can have a good life standards in their own country, but they just choose to earn less money just to have more freedom.
Yeah.
Even freedom of speech.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah. Go
I
ahead.
just wanted to put some perspective on the immigration. The U.S. I looked at this table, and of 28 countries that have immigrants, the U.S. is number 14. So there's 14 other countries that have more percentage of per capita as immigrants. So not everybody wants to come here.
I think you're right. Not everybody wants to come here. It's like the Geico commercials. Switch to Geico, and most people who switch to Geico save 15% or more, or something like that. Well, obviously, the people who are switching are the ones who are going to save money. There are plenty of people who don't switch to Geico because the prices are really bad, and then they're the ones who don't save money in switching to Geico, right? So yeah, there are plenty of people who don't want to immigrate to America, and there are plenty of people who don't want to switch to Geico. Yeah.
They just don't.
Yeah.
So, everybody thinks, oh, it's a huge problem, immigration in America, but it's really, you have to look at it in perspective. There's so many other countries that have so many more immigrants.
Yeah.
And in Luxembourg, for instance, do you know the percentage of the population is immigrants? 48%.
Does that include other Europeans? Because there's
That I
borders
don't
in the
know.
EU, right?
Probably,
So you might
yeah.
get a lot more immigration. It would be like moving across states.
Well,
But if you look
no,
at
I
something
don't
like
think so. I think, no, because the EU is
I
open
see. So
borders,
that wouldn't, they wouldn't
consider
call
them
it.
immigrants.
if you look at it,
Luxembourg imports a lot of, should we put this, money that folks want to keep in.
I see. So they're like a tax haven.
It's, money haven, probably
Money haven.
for taxes too.
Yeah.
Actually, I just read a book called To Be Friend is Fatal. It's a book about a guy who made an effort for people in principally Iraq, but also Afghanistan, who had supported U.S. military, who then became the subject of reprisals. And really the thrust of the book is how much effort he made to get the State Department, sort of immigration apparatus in the United States to be willing to accept these people who, he's making a pretty good case for how many people killed and, all kinds of violent reprisals. And it was really a monumental effort to enable these people to come into the United States after, basically, putting their life on the line to support U.S. military operations in those two countries. And actually went back, historically, Kissinger championed an effort to do the same in Vietnam for a rather very significant number of people,
The monk.
Vietnamese, to who were or would have been subject to reprisals by the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, when the United States left South Vietnam.
Yeah.
And actually it sort of started a little bit like what we saw in the present day until Gerald Ford's, and apparently some prompting. I'm not a huge fan of Kissinger, but at least on this subject, he apparently was a very strong proponent. Ford said, "Just do it, get them out of there," and there was a very significant movement of people out of South Vietnam to the United States. But a lot of good make it there, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of you were talking about the Hmong population. There are a lot of them in around Minnesota. I know because I lived in Wisconsin, and there were a lot of Hmong people who had went to University of Wisconsin and things like that.
All right, so let's do the next quote. If you have free immigration in the way we had it before 1914, everybody benefited. The people who were here benefited. The people who came benefited, because nobody would come unless he or his family thought he would do better here than he would elsewhere. And the new immigrants provided additional resources, provided additional possibilities for the people already here. So everybody can mutually benefit. So here he's talking about they're bringing their labor, and he's thinking that labor is the resource that the economy needs.
So he thinks they're bringing a resource commensurate, like actually in surplus of what they consume. That's like
Right.
an assumption he's making with the labor.
Right.
I mean, I said that before.
So if you're living in an economy where making up jobs for people to do as an excuse to pay them, then and that actually uses up resources, then people coming here and offering to work means you just have to create more jobs and use up more resources. So it doesn't work if you're talking about if you're not talking about labor as something that people are bringing that will contribute to the economy.
Well, not necessarily. mean, some of the jobs are not needing to be made up. I mean, like jobs that, that you were talking about. I mean, the high level
Right.
jobs don't need to be made up.
So here he's talking about free immigration.
Right.
So that means not restricting immigrants to just the jobs that we will, are, like that we're specifically
In need of.
in need of. He's
Okay.
assuming that all jobs are something that
Right.
we benefit from,
Right.
or that all labor is something that we benefit from.
Even if we don't have a job available, we'll just create one.
Right, like maybe we don't
Yeah.
need any more people working, but we create the jobs as a way to get them income. So I think if we're doing that and we have free immigration, then that aspect of it could actually be a drain on the resources. But I do think, I tend to believe that people are valuable, and even if they come and they're not contributing their labor, it's still, there's a lot of intangible things, a lot of externalities to having people and human minds, which are really powerful as part of your community, as part of your.
He doesn't really seem to
Yeah.
add those.
He doesn't talk about that. Yeah. So I think if you're just looking at specifically what he's looking at, it only works if we benefit from additional labor. And he's just saying this thing again about people won't come unless they feel they're going to be better off, and I think that's a good point. So I think he's right that the people who come are always going to be better off, unless they're completely wrong about their calculations, which some of them might be. So he's basically right about that. Within the framework that he's talking about, he might not be right that everyone else is better off. Yeah.
The economy as a whole might not be better off.
Right. If we're just thinking of them as units of labor, and we don't need more labor, but there's more to people than labor. So I would say there's a broader picture here. Yeah.
Oh, well, you can think about China. It's instead of immigration, it's migration from the countryside to the cities, and there's a lot of they're importing robots from Japan and places. So, and each robot takes 6 people, and they're trying to hold down the wages. So people are not actually quite a bit of time. People are not actually better off moving to the cities because they have to live in these slum locations and underground and things like that.
Yeah, they have these huge complexes next to the factories where the factory workers live and that kind of thing.
Why,
Yeah.
do you know why they keep moving there? Are they just uninformed, or is it still a little bit better?
They're kind of forced out of it because there's not enough jobs in their home village, and they're trying to send money back to their.
One thing that's really, I think, hard to keep in mind is, and economists aren't always so can be very blunt, but basically better off can be better off in something really terrible too, right? We're talking about with certain death from famine versus some terrible life that you're not necessarily dying from. It sounds like it might be the same kind of calculus there. They're better off, but it's a really bad versus an even worse.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But then you can go up another level and say if the Chinese government is instituting policies that are actually causing them to be worse off in the country, then are they better off than they were before those policies? Probably
It's a
not.
different question.
Yeah, that's a different question, but it's another question. So,
I mean, the other thing that's left out here is the immigrants who bring entrepreneur or, they create jobs. They're not coming to do a job that exists. They're creating jobs instead.
Right, which might not be
That's-
needed if we don't need more jobs and we don't need that business.
Well,
I think he would consider that part of labor, though. I think
You would-
that's
you would
kind
consider
of,
that part of
if you don't have any social support network in the, or sorry, financial support
yeah,
from the
well, it talks
country.
about free immigration to jobs.
Oh, I see.
You know,
Right.
and
Right.
Yeah.
it's sort of specifically to jobs, not to job creators.
So yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And in the context of what he's talking about, that's certainly a benefit.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's part of immigrating to jobs.
Yeah.
I want us to be in the habit here of not automatically thinking of job creation as a good thing for the economy. Go ahead, Sultan.
Well, I think creativity.
When we think about, for example, people who live in some African countries, UBI $1,000 will be a fortune for them. You know how
Yes.
much they spend in their countries. So I don't agree with this paragraph, and it also opposes to my, as I mentioned before, people don't come here only for money.
Right.
In this paragraph, it says if they wouldn't think they will do better in here, they wouldn't come.
But maybe he's including other things too. I don't know, like any reason.
Everything.
Yeah,
Oh,
maybe. Like I think the argument might be really simple on the immigration side, which is just like, I'm just guessing because I know some economists. Just the idea that like if you make a free choice, you're probably making because you think you're going to be better off. It's just like a tautology, like better off in any way.
Not just having
Not
a
just more
job.
money, maybe it's freedom, maybe it's whatever. But the economists are almost assuming that this free choice is going to lead you to be better off by whatever your own definition is, or you wouldn't make it unless you have bad information. That tends to be the kind of way that. So I'm guessing he's including all that stuff and just not really spelling it out. I think he's more interested in the side, in the U.S. side, like is it making us better off or not, citizens, U.S. citizens.
He's simplifying it though in the free immigration to jobs
Yeah.
paragraph. I mean, it's broader in the last paragraph.
Oh, I
like
see,
benefited. But in that paragraph, he's being very specific.
That's true. Yeah.
So I think we need to think of it as broader, but I don't know if he's thinking of it as broader. I think he's just thinking about jobs.
Yeah.
I don't see anything yet that.
I think he's not including any other benefits to the U.S.
Right, I agree.
I think he might be including the benefits to them because it doesn't matter if it's argument so
Yeah,
much,
yeah,
but
right,
like,
so that's,
but
right.
he's not including the other benefits to the U.S. Like, you know, I don't know, maybe coming up with a good volunteer program that's not
Right.
factoring into this, or like just being
No.
emotional support for your neighbors, or who knows,
Right,
having a
right,
good,
right.
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
He's not including any.
I disagree with that. I
Being a
mean,
soldier is not included, right?
I think he's basically saying that if you give them other benefits, if there are other benefits besides just the income they get from the job, then it can be a drain on the economy, right?
No, I'm saying that he's not including other benefits that the immigrants might bring to the United States that don't come through the labor market.
I disagree with your part about the immigrants receiving something other than income. I don't think he's including
That's not
that.
what I'm talking
I know you said that part and you kind of like set it to the side and then you switched to this other
about.
thing.
No, I was never saying that.
Okay, go ahead.
All I was saying is that he's including for a motive to move here. I think he's including any motive, including non-financial motives. On the
Right,
side
I
of
think
the
he's
immigrants.
not including that.
Oh, you
Is
don't.
what I'm saying. Right,
That's
exactly.
what he was saying.
Based on his calculation of if they're coming here, the benefit that they're getting has to somehow correspond to something they're contributing. So if they're getting more freedom, they're not necessarily contributing anything, right? So his calculation
Oh,
is
I see,
based,
right.
yeah,
Like they might come here even if they don't have a job based on the freedom or something like that, you're saying.
right.
You're
And then
right,
they're
okay,
just a
right.
drain; they're not actually
Right.
contributing.
I think that's.
You're right, I had that wrong.
Yeah, go ahead, Natalie.
Is it important to talk about how immigration policy has changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what this is about. He was
Well,
talking about how there used to be free immigration.
Before, not too long ago, the majority of people who came to this country were Europeans.
Right.
And this has completely changed now. So I'm not sure why I bring it up, but I feel that it's, it's significant for the way the UBI might be more or less efficient. In other words, the immigrants that came here before the change in policy were probably more educated, less poor, I think. And so, I don't know, maybe.
The immigrants who came here legally before the new
Yeah,
policy?
yeah.
I
mean, you remember the
Yeah.
quotas?
Yes.
Every country in Northern Europe, or Europe in general, had a quota. So
Right.
if you came from Holland or Sweden, the quota was much higher than if you came from Spain. So there was this, a bit like Canada, there's now, it's a very selective
Right.
system. And now it's very different, I think. There's,
For lottery, the impact system, there is no serious selection, I believe, for lottery party. Lottery means lottery. They only check their criminal background. That's it.
yeah.
They can be educated or not educated. They can come from.
Right. but maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but when I read Krugman's article,
Yeah.
he was actually in agreement with Friedman that you can't have both.
You can't have both.
You know?
Yeah.
But I was thinking, would he have said that 50 years ago, you know, when the majority of immigrants were? I mean, I don't know what to say about that.
I mean, I think it's still true that 50 years ago, we didn't have free immigration. So the immigrants we did have were, maybe Krugman would say that they were contributing and they were putting into the system and they were also receiving from the system.
They were earning more, I'm sorry to interrupt, but they were
Yeah.
earning more and they were paying more taxes.
They were earning more and they were paying more taxes. If we had had free immigration at that time, it might have been a different story. We might have had more people coming in for welfare benefits. You see what I mean? So he's not arguing against the immigration that we've had over the last 50 years, even 50 years ago. He's saying that you can't have free immigration at the same time that you have a welfare system.
Is that what he said?
Yeah,
You mean open border? Yeah.
open border, free immigration.
Okay.
Yeah. So did you have something you want to add?
I changed.
Okay. Yeah, Richard.
We're going to talk about how policy shapes immigration, like how with Brexit, people from Eastern Europe are moving out of Britain because of the uncertainty, and so since, for example, if there's not enough people picking strawberries, so that they're creating autonomous units, robots to pick strawberries. It's just part of what they're doing in the, New Mexico and Canada and California because of hostility towards Mexican immigrants. And there's even high end people fleeing from it with financial issues, the financial markets.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting point, and that speaks to the issue of whether illegal immigrants are doing jobs that are necessary. And if we kick the illegal immigrants out and we're replacing them with robots, then that kind of indicates that maybe they're doing jobs that weren't strictly necessary, and the only reason those jobs existed was because they were able to get the labor so dirt cheap that it wasn't worth it to use these other
It's
resources.
kind of related to a crazy argument, maybe a slightly crazy argument that's not well substantiated, but I'll just throw it out. It's kind of interesting. Like people have wondered why, even more technological advancement didn't happen even faster in places like ancient Rome, and slavery is one of the suggested possibilities. That labor was just so cheap. Like slave labor was so cheap that you didn't really have the incentive. I don't know how valid this is.
Like they actually had a steam engine back in
Yeah, they did
ancient
get
Rome.
pretty advanced, so I don't know if this is a decent. Sorry, people are going.
They had a steam engine in ancient Rome, but they didn't have any reason to improve upon it because of the cheap slave labor.
But I guess this is part of that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
I think nobody wants to replace their babysitter with a robot or something.
No, but a lot of them want to replace their babysitter with themselves. Like they would love to spend more time with their kid, but they have to be at work.
So
And there are robots for elderly people
Yeah.
to take care
Oh,
of the
yeah.
elders. So maybe,
This is their lack of qualified teachers.
yeah, I mean, that's kind of going on. That's been going on for a while, the hybrid classroom, computer and teacher, or even online classes displace the teacher entirely. And, record the famous professor's lectures and just use those, and the other professors can leave.
Yeah, if everyone has access to the best teachers in the world, the
Right.
rock star teachers,
Yeah.
then maybe the role of the other educational professionals is more to help guide the students than it is to build the curriculum or actually give the lectures, that kind of thing.
If everybody's learning from one teacher, it's going to be a really boring world.
that's one of the counter arguments. Yeah, that it's
Yeah.
too monotonous.
And I don't think everyone's going to just be learning from one teacher, but maybe you'd have like the best teacher teaching a
superstars.
specific viewpoint or a specific style, or like there might be like even now we have a lot of teachers that are kind of doing cookie cutter things, and they might not be doing them as well as.
We already have this with textbooks, and we don't really think about it. Like we have not a new textbook for every version of the class.
Have any of you heard of the Stanford, I forget what it's an engineering or science course, whatever it was.
This was machine learning.
This was the one,
Android.
distance learning, and so there were Stanford students who took the course on location in front of the, the lectures, but thousands who signed up to take the course remotely. And on the final exam, the top scoring Stanford student, the student who had sat in the classroom, there were like hundreds ahead of that student with higher scores of the students who had taken the course remotely.
Do you know if they did better on average?
The students in the classroom did much better than average. Most of the people who signed up online did not.
Oh, well, that's not really a fair test though, yeah, because people don't always take it equally seriously.
Right.
So it's not really.
So,
Which one was the better one? Remotely or?
The online.
The ones who were not in the class taking, on site.
So I want to quickly respond to one of Katie's concerns, that everyone's just going to be watching the same thing and learning, and it's going to be a really boring world. I think what we might see is actually a little bit in the other direction, because there's going to be all this amazing content out there, way more than any one person can learn, and then each student can decide their own kind of learning course, and you don't have to sync everyone up as much and keep everyone in the classroom kind of on the same schedule. So everyone could kind of follow their own curiosity, and I think that's something that would be really cool.
Two other little technology related a little bit to that folks might have seen or not. So I listened to a talk by a company. It's education in VR and virtual reality, and one of the things that happens in virtual reality is that the students don't see any of the other students, so the distractions that are typical in a classroom don't happen once the student goes into VR. And I've also seen demonstrations of software so you have a student sitting in, maybe it's a math concept or so, and so you have 10 students sitting in front of 10 different terminals. Moments after they start going through that module, what the student sees is different from one student to the next. And the reason is because the artificial intelligence behind the training module is determining the learning style, what the student is understanding, what the student is not understanding, so that it customizes the approach to ideally maximize the speed with which each student masters the concept, but each student is not necessarily mastering the concept at the same speed, but hopefully you're at least hitting an ideal. And so, when you see technology like that, the thing to understand is that you can't replicate that with a human teacher.
Yeah, so I think that's really cool. Kind of want to get back to immigration.
It does sort of figure into the whole, what I think some of the other people were bringing up, this whole changing nature of work.
And jobs, yeah.
And so if we're looking at immigration from the standpoint of access to basic income, access to whatever other reason immigrants immigrate for, then these are part of the discussion.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
have a question.
Yeah.
I was wondering if implementing or giving a UBI to immigrants would disincentivize them to assimilate.
I don't know. I think it depends. I think the more that we integrate immigrants with our policies, the more they're like other people, and the less we have to think about them as outsiders. Or if we say, okay, you're allowed to be here, it's legal. If we say you receive basic income like everyone else, or maybe you receive other benefits like everyone else, then I think it makes it easier for them to assimilate.
Well, the reason I'm saying this is because one of the results of poor social safety net in America is it's like a sink or swim situation, So you almost, and I speak from personal experience, you're almost forced to make yourself American again.
Right.
So if you do get money for free, then why? Why would you? What would force you to?
To do what, like to
Well,
learn language?
Well, not just, but become part of the culture and
Yeah.
send your kids to church.
Yeah.
I mean, go to church, which I know.
Right.
It's like
gathering communities.
yeah.
Like-minded
So
immigrants.
becoming an American,
Right.
and that pressure is actually much lower in Europe.
Yeah.
Not because people make it harder for you to become German or Dutch. In Germany, you have to have lived in Germany for 8 years before you can apply for citizenship. And here, you can become a citizen after 5 years. 5 years? Okay. And then your kids are American.
That's true.
That's not true in many countries, most countries. So there's this. On the one hand, there's an immigrant policy. On the other hand, it's just baked into this country that immigrants are part of the population.
That's interesting.
I'm just curious, do we think that forcing people to become American is a good thing that we want to be doing? Like to be like, okay, like you have to learn English and you have to like adopt to the ways that we do certain things. Like, is it possible that if instead we're like, okay, like you can like be here and like bring more and like retain more of your culture and your language, and maybe we'll adapt some and like start like teaching languages other than English to kids before like 7th grade when they still have better neuroplasticity, and be like, okay, this could be more of like a salad metaphor instead of a melting pot of like, you just have to like get rid of everything that we find irritating about you and become just like us, and then you're allowed to stay. Like, would that possibly make us a richer
Well,
place?
I don't know if we're deviating from the subject.
No,
I'm
we're
going to
not.
answer you there. In Europe, the integration policy has really not worked,
Mhm.
And it's not a good thing because there's all these there's discontent both amongst the immigrants and the native population because they just don't mesh. So I think to answer your question, whether it's a good thing to not have such a strong safety net, which in my view is not, but one of the benefits is that people have to.
I mean, I certainly believe that I believe you that that there are ways in which it hasn't worked in Europe. I'm just curious about. I believe you that the sort of the failure of folks to integrate has been a problem in Europe. I'm just curious if there's a way, and I know that's not something that we can answer in Europe, about like, is there a way that we could find something that's maybe not assimilate or die the American model, or the ways in which it's not working in Europe of like, okay, these people aren't meshing and that's causing a lot of conflict. Like, is there a way that we could find some way that's in between those?
I think Martin's raising his hand.
Oh, okay.
I was gonna say, again, a little personal anecdote. When my dad, the German side of it, all that, was growing up, his parents would not speak German in front of the kids. And, for what it's worth, flip around, well, okay, but my son learned 3 languages starting at 3 and a half. And so obviously, I must have valued that a little bit or whatever. My Russian spy has a funny thing. I asked her one time, why do so many people around the world choose English as their second language? I mean, it's the lingua franca of the world, right? Why'd that happen and all that? And why not Russian? And she always tells me, well, that's just because Americans are just trying to take over the world, and Russia's not trying to take over the world. And I'm like, no, I don't think that's actually a good explanation. to my only point is, to sort of your point, again, I value multiple, and I obviously my son, I made that possible for him. But I do think there's value in a society not imposing English, but in thinking of ways that you can be the society that everybody in that society values enough, learning a common language, that they learn it, as I like to say, not at the point of a gun, but because they value it and they do it willingly. And the society that sort of thinks that way, sometimes I think is a little bit better society because we just are.
Yeah, go ahead, Mom.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, language is huge. I mean, learning the language or not learning the language, that's huge. But also the cultural communities that spring up. I mean, it's not as if people who are from a different nationality don't have community in the United States. They often do. They form communities for that reason. And they speak the language of their community when they're with their community. But when talking about cultural things, it's not just the language, it's also mores, like we were talking about earlier, you know, the grabbing of women and, you know.
Which we have enshrined in the White House. So
I know.
So
I know.
the idea of the U.S. as
Right.
as a bastion where we're going
But we
to
don't
impose our
We don't want
morals.
to use him as an
Our
independent
morals are not
example.
always the ones that would want us to be.
Right.
imposing.
Cultural, I mean, the treatment of women, that's a pretty good example. You know, if you're in Saudi Arabia, you can't drive. And, well,
Actually,
you
you
can
can
now.
now.
I think you have to have
No,
some.
they just changed it.
Oh, they changed it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So you
Yeah,
don't
it's
have
just
somebody with
Big
you?
news.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, happened earlier this summer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, but, you know, the expectations for women are very different in other cultures, and you don't necessarily want them on an equal par, I wouldn't, with what's happening for women in America.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
and certainly
so-
I would want us to continue to improve our social mores.
Yeah,
but-
so I mean, acceptance and tolerance and integration of other cultures is to be, you know, commended and strived for. But it's also true that there are American mores and there is an English language that we value. Language isn't just language either. I mean, there's a huge amount of evidence about the domination of a culture or not. I mean, the Gaelic language, for example, has pretty much disappeared. We don't necessarily want to encourage English to disappear. It's not exactly going to do that, but there's value in English, in the language of English, in the language of our culture, just as there's value for other people's language. But if we're going to another country, we'd probably want to learn that language too.
They would want us to. As Americans, I think we're not very good at doing that.
Yeah, they want us to.
We're like, well, you should just learn English. And they're like, I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
I
I know like
Well,
French,
that's
German,
an
and Spanish.
attitude.
I'm like, what have you got?
Right, and that's an attitude. I mean, I don't think it's all that big a deal to expect people to integrate to the culture at large.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not saying that people shouldn't I think most people will want to learn English because it's very difficult to get around in this
Yes.
country.
Right.
If you don't,
Right.
I think it's also true that there are ways in which we stigmatize any non-proficiency
Okay.
in English, such that first generation immigrants will often not speak their native language to their children
Right.
because
Yeah.
they don't want to like ruin their children. They're like, oh well, you need to learn English. Like you will be disadvantaged. You know, you'll have like broken English, or like you'll be stigmatized for slipping into this other language. And I would love if one of the social mores that we could improve on was to like see knowing multiple languages as a positive
I
thing
agree.
and having different cultural backgrounds
I
as something
agree.
positive people are bringing,
Yeah.
instead of being like, oh, you weirdo, like from a Latin American country, like you live with your extended family, like that's so terrible. It's like, well, actually, there's a lot that's really positive.
Right.
But that there are things that we can learn from other places. It's not all like, oh, you're stuck in a previous century. Like we got past that. There are ways in which it's like, yeah, we're kind of doing this in a toxic way, and maybe other people have something that we could learn from.
And to Madeline's point about basic income encouraging not adaptation, I mean, I don't know that that's true, because just because you're not forced to learn English for your job, for example, there's a lot of cultural force around you to have people adapt to the language, just going to the store, interacting with people. Maybe
No,
it's
I
not
was-
just about the job.
Not the job, but you know, if you surviving, if you
Yeah.
if you take away that pressure, I wonder how it would change.
Yeah, I think you'd want to adapt even if, you know, you have the income. I don't know, I have no idea, there's no evidence for any of it, but I guess you're saying that there is evidence for non-adaptation.
I think she was just throwing it out there
Yeah,
as
okay.
a possibility.
Yeah.
Did you have something you
Yeah,
wanted
I
to
have a few
say?
things. Just trying to think about, kind of big picture, what are the costs and benefits? So on the one hand, like learning from other people, the more models you have to learn from. That's kind of the history of civilization improving. So there's really positive sides. And there's sort of costs in a way that I think can be kind of, some of them are just very morally neutral. Like people have different norms or like different coordination points. Language is one thing. We coordinate on what words mean. And it's costly, at least in time and energy. It could have benefits, but it's costly to learn the other way. And how much noise should you have at night in the apartment building? It's not that one is better than the other. Just there are different things that people coordinate on, and then there can be friction when you aren't coordinating. And that's a real cost. And then there's this sort of deeper thing where people value what they value. So in Saudi Arabia, people might be horrified by the idea of the American treatment of women from Vietnam. And here, where we really value the way that we handle women's rights, and so we don't really want that to go away. And I think that's to be respected. And some of the things that maybe we don't like, about how people are going to go through the top against other people, maybe they come from that fear that like we really deeply value certain things. So, for example, a concrete example is like honor killings are a problem in the United States. And right now it's a really minority of people that are killing their own daughters out of these things. But I think a lot of Americans would really care about keeping that not on an equal footing with them.
Yeah.
And likewise in those countries, as much as I disagree with that, they wouldn't want our values coming in, and as much as I don't share this. So it's this is something just to be negotiated with this question of immigration, especially if you're doing things like New York.
So, quickly, Richard, go ahead.
Oh, it could be that technology decreases the need to learn other languages. Like I remember seeing a few years ago how you can take a picture of a sign and it automatically translates it into English, or you can have like a earbud in your ear and someone's talking and that automatically translates it into English or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I was actually going to bring that up myself. And I also want to say I agree with Bethany, and I agree with Madeline, and I agree with Elizabeth.
But not me.
I agree with you too.
I noticed you left me out.
I think there are certainly ways in which we want to integrate and accept, new people who come in, and I think it'd be great if they, felt like they were Americans and they were part of our American society, and they felt supported and they felt like they were, part of things. And I also think Elizabeth is right that, we want to celebrate, all the amazing cultural and linguistic diversity that people bring with them. And I like the analogy of a salad as opposed to a melting pot. I think that's really important too. And I think it's maybe in different areas. So in some areas we want to integrate. In some areas maybe we want to impose our own values, like in women's rights. And then in other areas we really want to embrace the cultural diversity and possibilities. So I think all of this is important.
And I guess just one more side point is that we already have a lot of cultural difference, within the United States, and a lot of like self-selection of where we live and stuff. So it's not an issue unique to people, just unique to people coming from technically other countries and stuff. It's something we're always negotiating.
And we don't need to force people to like be like us and everyone's exactly the same. There's already diversity and people find their people and connect with them and that kind of thing. And that's good.
One more.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think nobody complains about obligation for learning English. I think so. I'm
There's-
talking about immigrants.
There is some political debate over this.
There's a lot of
Yeah.
complaints.
But I don't know how much
No,
of it comes from
people.
the
I'm
immigrants.
talking about people. They don't complain about it.
The
I
immigrants?
didn't see anybody who is an immigrant person
Yeah.
and complain about learning.
About
English. I
having
don't
to,
think
yeah.
so.
But
They are
where it
happy to do that, I believe.
Where it comes up
I think-
a lot is in documents, like official documents being presented in multiple languages, where
Like in the EU.
the friction is over the idea that, well, wait a minute, why should American government provide documents in multiple languages? Shouldn't the individual learn the language of the documents?
Right.
So you might not see it as much, but there is a lot of tension over the language.
I don't think immigrants are objecting to learning English,
Right.
but there are immigrants who haven't learned English that well yet, and there's
Like
some
me.
and there's some political debate over whether we should provide non-English resources to help them, and some people say no, they have to learn English before they can fill out their tax forms or something like that, and I think that's a valid debate, and I think there's
It's impossible to provide with their native language, these sources because maybe 140 country language. So
Well, first of all, it is
Impossible.
possible to do 140 languages. That's not that many languages, and like
You can
We
use
could- we
Google
could do that.
Translate or something.
and we could use Google Translate. But I think there are some main languages that we're thinking about, and it's primarily Spanish for immigrants from Mexico or Mexican speaking for
Spanish
speaking
speaking.
families, yeah, and maybe to some degree French as well,
And it's often localized that you'll get like documents in Chinese or like Portuguese,
Right.
a lot in
And
Somerville.
right,
or
Portuguese is a big one, and Chinese
Yeah,
as well.
and Mexican,
But
I mean, that was
isn't it
huge.
already a lost battle? Because even phone messages
Yes.
was
Para español,
Yeah.
para todos.
Yeah.
That's different.
First one.
Yeah.
50 years ago, when I was in Tucson, people were very upset about bilingual education. Very upset about Mexican
Yeah.
and Spanish.
I mean, I
And
think
presenting things in two
we're-
languages.
We're getting towards the end here, but I think the point is that I think Sultan's right that immigrants aren't objecting to learning English, and that everybody else is also right that there is this tension in providing bilingual or multilingual resources. I just want to quickly get to some quotes from the second article. So Krugman says the benefits of immigration to the population already here are small. The reason is that immigrant workers are, at least roughly speaking, paid their marginal product. So he's basically saying they're being paid commensurate to the amount of labor that they're contributing. So he's kind of making this assumption about labor as well. And he says an immigrant worker is paid roughly the value of the additional goods and services he or she enables the U.S. economy to produce. So this is the assumption that the immigrants are bringing resources with them, but they're taking as much money away roughly as they're given. So that means there isn't anything left over to increase the income of the people already here. So I think that ties back into what we were talking about last week, where if we think about money as this finite thing that's kind of being taken by the immigrants, then yes. But if the immigrants are providing resources somehow, like he's thinking in terms of labor, then that has nothing to do with the amount of money they're being paid or anything like that. They're just adding more, and it's more the resources that they use up rather than the money that they use up. And then at the end he talks about the fiscal burden, and that's like the assumption that we need to balance our budget and that kind of thing. And I don't think this is the right way to think about the costs or benefits of immigration, especially when you factor in like human well-being and just the benefit of having people. So I think there's a lot here, and he's basically he agrees with Friedman that you can't have free immigration, open borders at the same time that you have a welfare state. And he comes down the other side saying we need the welfare state, so we shouldn't have open borders and free immigration. Yeah, go ahead, Madeline.
Don't you think it has to do with that switch with the type of immigration that is coming in the United States? Actually, worldwide, I would say.
You mean the recent switch in the last 50 years?
Yeah.
I don't think so, because he's really talking about free immigration, like completely open borders, and the tension there is between that and the welfare state.
So I don't understand. I'm sorry, I'm taking
Yeah,
the
go
last few minutes. But after the Second World War, there was the biggest immigration or immigration
Right.
Of the entire history of the world, and
It wasn't free open immigration though. It still had restrictions on it. Yeah, it was controlled.
controlled by who? I thought all these, Germans, they were expelled from all these other countries in the East, and
Yeah.
I mean, everybody was going somewhere else in Europe at that time, and they did create the
Yeah.
biggest welfare society
Yeah.
ever. So
I mean, I think you're right, and there's certainly like we can analyze individual situations, and I think I personally like maybe this is evidence that these arguments are wrong, that you can have welfare, you can have open immigration. Like they weren't trying to have open immigration, but then war happened, so then you gotta do what you gotta
they
do.
did create welfare. I mean,
Right, and they did create welfare, and I think, and it wasn't necessarily that everybody from Africa and Asia was coming into Europe either, but I think these guys are wrong. I think you can have a welfare state and open immigration at the same time, It might affect how much of a welfare state you can provide, how many resources you can devote to people who are coming in, and how many resources you can devote to citizens. But it's unclear how that all shakes out because we do live in a global economy. So I mean, like in my mind, I think to bring it back to basic income, if we're doing a basic income, I kind of want I don't want to like make any huge sudden changes all at once to have like a big shock to the economy, but I kind of want to move towards more and more open immigration and move towards more and more of a basic income and see what we can sustain, see what we have the resources to sustain. I think that's the way to go. Yeah.
And I would just emphasize that you could separate in your view, like who you give the basic income to and immigration if you wanted to.
You could decide not to give basic income to non-citizens. You could decide not to give basic income to illegal immigrants. You could decide not to give basic income to foreigners.
Or you could decide to give basic income to everybody,
Or you could decide to give it to everybody.
whether or not they live in.
I think most basic income proponents, most people who are debating basic income feel like it's at odds with open borders, and they feel like, well, if you're going to give everybody a lot of free money, then you can't let too many immigrants in because they'll all come for the free money, and I don't think that's necessarily going to be as big of a problem as people are making it out to be. All right.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Next week we're talking about technological unemployment. So I hope Martin comes for that one because that's his.
We end up on that topic anyway, so people should.
I know.
Yeah. Like,
Talk about the robots.
it'll be different for every other session,
Yeah.
only in the amount of time.
Right,
that we
right.
devote to
And the
it.
fact that we don't have to go back to some other.
Yeah.
We're all connected.
What